And then I just feel better when I come to counseling because, they listen and they tell me it's going to be okay. But that only lasts for a day or two. And then I can't wait for my next appointment because then they'll validate me.
It's an addiction.
It is. It is. And they're living on the validation of an expert saying that it's going to be okay and them not knowing inside of them that they'll be okay.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome. I'm here today with Dr. Jessica Stone, who is an author and spiritual counselor, and I'm looking forward to a great conversation. So, Doctor, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
So let's start off with a little background information on you. Who are you and where do you come from?
Yeah, so currently I live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, Texas, but I lived most of my life in a suburb of Minneapolis. So, yeah.
Gotcha. And how did you get into like the clinical world, the psychology world, the counseling world?
Yeah, I mean, it's the stereotypical joke of I was a pretty high anxious teenager, young adult, and I needed to figure out how to fix myself. So I was a self-proclaimed self-help junkie, reading all the books, and I was a Christian from a young age, and I just did not know how to do that. So went to school, went to undergrad and then graduate school to become a marriage and family therapist. Yeah, to first heal myself and then hopefully help heal others.
What was that experience like for you going to graduate school, going through that training? Like, how do you feel like it prepared you well?
Great question. Yes and no. So I went to a graduate school that was not Christian. And so I think that the Lord really allowed me to do that for a reason, so that I could see what they were teaching, how that did or didn't work, what I wanted to take with me into my counseling practice. And that really came to fruition as I started to apply it to working with families. I just did not see that most of the things that I learned in school helped me to really bring people to a greater level of flourishing, functioning. I felt like it was more about coping and diagnosing. Like, let me give you an explanation for why you suffer the way you suffer, but then not practical application on how to fix that. So, but I wouldn't have known that had I not had the education. So it was almost learning what not to do and what doesn't bring healing that brought more revelation. And that was absolutely true in my own life. Trying to apply what I knew, what I was taught about anxiety disorders did not deliver me from my anxiety. So,
Interesting.
yeah, it caused me to really go deep and ask the Lord, what is it that we're missing? Even those who have been trained in Christian counseling, that we don't see more freedom, more life transformation.
What do you think the field is missing in regard to anxiety?
It's the idea that if you observe what makes you anxious, then you can control it. And that's just not the case. So people can do a daily log of this is what makes me anxious, and you rate it from 1 to 10, and what are your triggers? We love that word. And then the idea is just the knowing sets you free. It doesn't. It may bring you some comfort and make you feel like you're not crazy. You can have camaraderie with other people. I've seen that. Once you get a diagnosis, you go, oh, do you have an anxiety disorder? Yeah. And then, you don't feel crazy, but you don't feel free. So, yeah.
Do you feel like some degree of focusing on those problems or even rumination makes the issue worse?
Totally. Absolutely. Yeah. So I don't know if we're ready for this in the
Yeah.
stage of our conversation, but one of my breakthrough techniques and therapeutic interventions was to help people break free of their diagnoses. Because once I saw that someone would get diagnosed, whether it was a physical diagnosis or a mental health diagnosis, that admission and that almost surrender to what those symptoms are and what that diagnosis all envelops, how much worse their symptoms would be. And now this just became a lifelong sentence. Like, I have chronic and severe depression, And so teaching my clients how to break off the curse of a diagnosis. A diagnosis was always meant to lead us to a treatment plan that would heal you. But I don't see that. In my years of working in a clinical practice, I just saw people looking for more and more diagnoses. And then they say things like mine, like it's my anxiety and my depression, my heart issues, if it's a physical issue. Yeah. And there's no healing in that diagnosis.
Do you see, like in the contemporary era, people getting something out of a diagnosis? Like there's forming an identity around a diagnosis or even gaining some kind of social capital around having a diagnosis?
Absolutely. Yep. And if we had more time, I could even tell you where and why it comes from their hardwiring or their desire to be taken care of or loved, that, oh, now that I have this disability, people understand me or take notice of me. I need things like doctor's appointments and counselors and psychiatrists. It's almost a way that they feel like they belong.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
When did you graduate from grad school?
2000.
2000. Okay. So something I've noticed more recently is there's like a political and religious bias that you see in graduate schools. And I'm wondering if it was like that even back when you were going to school.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that was probably the hardest part about going to a secular graduate program is that it was constantly warring against my biblical principles and what I knew once I left that I was going to change and not adhere to.
Did you get that idea? Like for me, a lot of times it's not like an overt hostility to Christianity, but more of like a dismissiveness. Did you pick
Oh,
up on that?
absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's with the idea that they're saying that people can't judge them. So they try to be very careful not to sound judgmental in how they talk about it, but it's really not encouragement of those beliefs or a genuine regard for you believe in those things.
Yeah, it seems like the not judging may have stemmed from a good place at one point, but it kind of gets to the place where you're not willing to say anything to a person who's actively involved in harming themselves.
Right. Exactly. Yes. Yep.
Yeah. How do you go about that without being like coming across as like heavy-handed, judgmental, but also having the compassion to intervene?
With my clients or with people who are not like-minded?
I would say first with your clients.
Yeah. So one of the principles from which I would counsel is I would start from James 1:8, when it talks about that a double-minded man can't be blessed and they're unstable in all their ways. And so whatever level of maturity a person might claim to be a Christian or even have some spiritual beliefs, that would be my challenge is you have to, on the inside of you, decide, are you 2 feet in? Do you ascribe to this completely and wholly? Because as long as you say, I want a little bit of this belief and this belief or that standard of living, that's where I saw people struggle. Just like it says, unstable in all of their ways. So now it's impacting your mental health, your relationships, how you view healing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's I love that, but it seems very contrary to like the mainstream opinion where you're supposed to treat beliefs as though they're like a buffet and you can get a little of each one.
And that's why we are where we're at, where mental health is at. Absolutely. Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Yeah. I mean, the idea that you can choose to think and believe whatever you want, knowing that we are a broken people and we live in a broken world, it's just the petri dish for anxiety and fear and confusion because you never really know what's the right thing to do or believe. And if a person can change that at will, they don't know this, but the spirit that God created on the inside of them, it feels chaotic. It feels like you're being tossed from one thought, school of thought to another. And so until people realize that there's one absolute truth, which we find in scripture, that's how they feel and they don't know where it's coming from. Like even the idea of anxiety is because they're not tethered to something that makes them feel secure. So the best way I can describe it or relate to it, because so many years I did in-home family counseling and I did a lot to do with parenting skills, it's the boundaries that we set up for our children. And a child who doesn't have that structure and know where that boundary is, the absolute truth and absolute rules of their life, they have anxiety and they act out, So we never outgrow that as human beings. We need the boundaries of this is how to think in order to flourish. This is what you do when you're suffering in order to endure. Like we need those things, and we just don't teach that in the world. Not even in the Christian counseling world. I don't see that.
Wow. Yeah, I think a lot of the mainstream would say that that view is like narrow-minded or exclusionary, but I like with my men's Bible study, we would say if God's closing a door, that's actually an act of compassion because it's preventing you from going down a less than ideal path.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I've been accused of being that way. That's a label that people have put on my ministry is called kingdom mindset. And so I've heard that. Like that's very excluding of people when you say like you have to belong to the kingdom. And I'm like, yep, it is. That's the point. You either belong and you choose to be in this space or you don't. And so it's just funny why people, if that's not what they choose to believe, why are you offended that that's how it works?
I mean, I think if they were like if you're honest and you like actually believe this stuff, that it would be like incredibly uncompassionate not to try to direct people in that way.
Exactly.
So tell me, you know, from my perspective, I see over the last several decades a decline in religious participation, including church attendance, and an increase in mental illness. I'm wondering if you see a connection between those two.
Absolutely. And, we can prove that out because of COVID. The statistics of people who not going to church, not fellowshipping even with their small groups or Bible studies, and the increase in suicidality and emergency room visits having to do with panic, anxiety, depression, increase in prescriptions for those mental health issues. It was very evident. That was a unexpected science experiment, I think.
Wow.
One of the things, just to add one more thing to that I saw as so evident and scary of the trend of isolating and being more and more on our phones and social media is the age at which they saw emergency room mental health issues.
Really?
Yep. So as young as 10 and 11 that they were suicidal and having these panic attacks. That's not normal in the mental health arena of understanding brain development and when emotions kick in. That's much more that 14, 15. That's when we start to see teenagers struggle. But 10 or 11, yes, that is an absolute product of not coming together, not having that relational connection that brings health and healing to human beings.
Wow. What kind of pushback have you gotten from other people in the field about your
Where do we start, right? um, in the field in particular, so I'll give you the catalyst for why I left clinical practice. I used to work at a large hospital system back in Minnesota, is that there seemed to be a specific prejudice against Christianity. Like you were saying for graduate school, I saw that in the clinic space as well. And so I had a client who was in high school, but she was 18, and she was very interested in learning more about the Bible and how it could help her overcome. She had severe depression, suicidal thoughts, and she was just starting to get into her faith. And so at the time, there was a church, wasn't even my church, but a church that was going deep into the Bible and really breaking it down to be able to understand it easily. So I gave her a card and just said, hey, if you want to learn more, this might be a great community resource for you. And my job was threatened over that. Now, we also, in that same clinical space, had pamphlets for the local gym that was offering meditation, yoga, Buddhist type views, but that was okay. And when I brought that to administration and said, we can recommend this, but not this, and they said, yeah, that's what we've decided to ascribe to and support.
they there was like they just defended that.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep. Isn't that interesting? So I
Wow.
thought, and it was, I mean, to the point where I might lose my job over this. And I just thought, if I can't even invite someone who asked for it, I didn't push it, I wasn't trying to impose my beliefs. She was hungry and asking, help me. Um, that just wasn't the space for me anymore.
That's so wild. Like from a client-centered, person-centered perspective, it seems like you would want to honor the client's wishes. She was asking for these type of resources. It would make no sense for you to say, "Well, here, go practice some Buddhist meditation."
No. Yeah, exactly.
That's bizarre to me. And so you left there. Where did you go after that?
So I started my own practice so that I could do that, really teach people what I wanted to teach them without the control or the fear of someone being upset with what I was doing. And in that same vein, in order to not fall under restrictions of the board, the Marriage and Family Therapy Board, I no longer practiced under a license as well. So I switched to more of a faith-based spiritual counseling and coaching umbrella.
Was there like a threat from the board? Like, how did that go down?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long story, but yeah, eventually it was a point where I just had to make a decision that either I ascribe to what they call their ethics and how they think that we should operate as far as how much Jesus we include, how you pray with people. I even had some pushback from insurance companies, based on my notes. They want to see more of the worldly, what they would say is efficacy in therapeutic techniques, like are you using CBT, DBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, in order to even approve and pay for the sessions for my clients. So again, once I started getting those types of things, if I'm going to be honest about what we're doing in the session, I'm teaching biblical principles and then we pray about it. And I
Uh,
see people finding freedom and getting better in 2, 3, 4 sessions versus people going to counseling for years. There was still not that acceptance by the world to pay for it, to validate it. So it was just easier, honestly, to not continue to fight that. Now,
wow.
I will say that I believe there are therapists that are called by God to fight that, to continue to stay in that space, licensed, pushing the boundaries, for Christian beliefs. That just wasn't me.
Mm, wow. Were there like other therapists who commented saying that what you were doing was unethical?
Not unethical, but they had concern. They said things like, if you continue to do this, especially the type of prayer that I was praying with people, you're going to get in trouble with, the licensing board. So there was just this common, I would say, fear among practicing therapists that were licensed by a board, different boards too, like a licensed psychologist or an LMFT, licensed social worker, colleagues in all of those areas. They had that same fear of, we can only do this, this level of talking about Jesus and prayer. And you want to do this level, like, Jessica, you're going to get in trouble. I had multiple people say, you're going to lose your license over this. So,
Was there something different about the way that you were praying compared to what they would consider like a standard acceptable prayer?
yeah, it was much more directive. So, you said something before about being the client centered, they're asking for it. Well, one of the things at this point, it was like 17 years of being a professional counselor. I know what brings people freedom and healing. They don't know what they don't know. Right. And so instead of just being empathetic, listening, asking strategic questions, I really switched hats and became a teacher.
Mm,
And so it was much more like, you need to know this because without it, you will never have freedom. And me asking you questions will never get you to a truth that you're not. That's the whole point of revelation, is that it's something you don't know and you have to
mm.
receive it. Right. Yeah.
Man, that's really interesting. I respect the concept of client-centered care in the sense that everyone operates from their own framework and you have to understand where someone's coming from. But it often goes so far as to have this kind of affirming model where like basically like the client is always right, essentially.
Right.
And if that's true, why are they here? You know?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what kind of feedback do you get from your clients?
Honestly, the more that I practice in that way, where I really am the expert who comes in and says, I've seen this 100 times. This is what the biblical answer is. People are so grateful. One of my favorite stories that happened a few years ago was a woman who had been in counseling for 20 years for anxiety. And it was, I can't work, I'm on disability. She didn't drive. She barely left her home, like on the verge of agoraphobia because of this level of anxiety. And so my question to her is, what have you achieved in 20 years? Well, I deeply understand it. And she jokes, like I could probably teach, a diagnostic class on anxiety and the symptoms. And then I just feel better when I come to counseling because, they listen and they tell me it's going to be okay. But that only lasts for a day or two. And then I can't wait for my next appointment because then they'll validate me.
It's an addiction.
It is. It is. And they're living on the validation of an expert saying that it's going to be okay and them not knowing inside of them that they'll be okay. Yeah. So with this woman in particular, being able to be directive with her and rather than the poor woman, it was whiplash from what she was used to me. And I'm like, you don't get to talk like for at least the first 2 sessions, because I needed to educate her in the ways of freedom from anxiety. And this is what scripture says. And this is how you set your mind on something that will actually bring healing and freedom.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Do you see yourself as continuing what Jesus and then later the disciples started with healing, casting out demons? I know like the demon thing might be like trip some people up, but I think it's hard to distinguish between that and mental illness. Like when you look at it a lot of times, do you see like continuing that lineage?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The whole demon thing, I just tell people that those are names that the world ascribes to something we can't explain. So you can just call it a spirit of anxiety or a spirit of depression. The world has come up with labels because they don't understand the spiritual battle or they don't understand how mental illness really does come from our brokenness in this world, and we have to actually heal, step into healing of the mind. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but it's one of my favorite things to teach. But the word mindset, or we know in Colossians 3:2, it says, set your mind on the things above. That word set is a medical term, like how a doctor sets a bone. And so God's really saying your mind is fatally broken because of living in this world, and it's a playground for the enemy. And so you have to set it back into place very intentionally over and over so that it functions in the way that it should, so that it can heal. So that's, when it comes to talking about spirits and demons, yeah, I'm talking about what are those specific things that bring you back out of your peace and your healing? And then we name it, So whatever type of oppression that is, fear, doubt, confusion, those are all spirits that are attacking you. Yeah.
Wow. Like I think it's in 2 Timothy where it says God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. So like mental health, a sound mind is like a spiritual directive. It's a commandment in the Bible. I like that.
Yes, that's perfect.
Yeah. Tell me other ways where you think the kind of mainstream mental health or therapy profession is missing the mark.
One of the things that seem to bring people to a higher level of freedom in their mental and emotional state was to understand that the world, like you said earlier, in good intention, like they're saying, we shouldn't judge people. But then they say things that are highly judgmental. And then saying things like, God won't give you more than you can handle. And this is said by non-believers. It's like a quippy little thing that we should say when we're going through something hard, and it's supposed to like help people feel better. And so what happened is the world took and slightly twisted and perverted something that should be good and healthy. And it's so confusing for people that it leaves them in this place of either thinking they are weak, they have no faith, God doesn't really exist. It's the mixed messages that I see cause the most mental illness in people.
Mm.
Another great one is social media. We're told over and over, you can look any way you want to look, especially women, you don't have to be a certain size and you should just love who you are and be proud of whatever size you are, how you look. But then everything else that you see on social media is youth and perfection and, being super fit. How are people supposed to, truly feel grounded when it's that dualistic messaging constantly?
Wow. Yeah. There seems to be like a spirit of like comfort first in therapy where like self-soothing, self-care are very important, where like in a biblical perspective, we're often called to discomfort. Do you wrestle with that?
I don't personally wrestle with it, but it's definitely. Oh, you mean how they teach that?
Yes, yes.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. So yeah, that's one of the principles that I teach in the first, 2, 3 sessions with a new client is what the Bible actually says about suffering and discomfort and what the world has taught us. And to be honest with you, I think it's the foundation for most mental illness is this false teaching.
Oh.
Yep.
Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, the scripture that I teach from is Philippians 2, and it says, have this attitude, or some versions say mindset, literally, of
Hmm.
Jesus. And then it goes on to say, this is what Jesus's mind is like. And it's about submitting, surrendering, suffering, and sacrifice. That's the mindset we're supposed to have, not self comfort, self soothing, self preservation, self protection, all of those self concepts that we're taught and that are instinctual, by the way. Like, we don't even need to be taught that by the world. It's part of just having flesh, It's why little 2-year-olds fight over toys. No one taught them that. It's self preservation. They want what's theirs and what pleases their flesh. So, teaching people, how do I have a mindset where discomfort and suffering doesn't wreck me? That now you will thrive in your mental and emotional health.
Wow. That is interesting. Yeah, I mean, it just seems so contrary to all the messages that we get.
I know. And the
Yeah.
consumerism, like, think what would happen to modern marketing if, we really promoted that the lack of needing to soothe or to find things that make us feel good about ourselves. I mean, that would take away 99% of, the marketing that's out there, the products that are out there.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of contemporary therapy is centered around, or at least exacerbates, self-absorption, like all
Absolutely.
that focus on self. And I think a biblical concept of mental health would be like the pouring outwards rather than inwards.
Yep. Which is one of my first prescriptions. Like, if there's anything I prescribe to a client, it's to go and serve, go volunteer in your community. Yeah, especially for people with depression. It's the last thing you want to do. You want to curl up and focus on yourself, but there is such healing that comes from being outward focused and experiencing the joy of helping someone else have a better day.
It seems like the therapy profession, from what I can tell, is like on guard against rare events. Like, well, what if you volunteer too much and get burnt out? Whereas, like, a person with depression is like struggling to get out of their house at all, And it's like, it feels like they're fighting the wrong battle a lot of times.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, I've actually had quite a few people challenge me on that, even Christians, when I talk about, the self sacrifice, the cost of true discipleship, of following Jesus. And they'll come back with, well, what about self care? What about soul care? And I'm like, that again is such a rarity that as human beings, we would give to the point of that level of exhaustion or burnout. Yeah, I'm not too worried about that, and I don't take that into much consideration when I'm teaching these things. There's a natural tendency for human beings to come back to a place of self care.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, and I would tell you that we have a false conception or notion about burnout. But what
Oh.
people measure as burnout, like, "Oh, I'm serving too much, or all I do is take care of other people," it's still their mindset that's broken, not the activity. It's how they perceive
Hmm.
Are people reciprocating? Do they make me feel appreciated? There's still things that they have an agenda with it that then leads to disappointment or resentment. So now you're not doing it from a pure heart. And that's the burnout. It's your mindset, not the actual things that you're doing, which with a good mindset would be still joyful.
I feel like proper volunteering or pouring out to others is like what fills up my cup. And I feel like for me, if I'm constantly going within, thinking about myself, it's like I'm constantly empty because I'm not appropriately filling up by pouring out. That makes sense.
Perfect sense.
Yeah.
It's an insatiable desire. If we have to think about filling ourselves up and what makes us happy, you'll always be discontent.
Tell me what kind of pushback you've gotten from other Christians or Christian therapists.
Probably just to the level of which I ask my clients to ascribe to a new mindset. I think they think that's too much, that we should let people, again, it comes back to that let people come to that way of thinking themselves. Like they have to be comfortable with it. I make people feel very uncomfortable for the first couple sessions, but I do that in a relational way. So it's not that I don't care about how they feel or how hard what the concepts I might be challenging them with, but it's because I care about them, because I see that they're suffering and I want freedom for them, that I would challenge them so directly. So, and there are certainly people who don't receive it well. And then that gets back to my colleagues and they're like, well, in the first or, 2 sessions, you didn't even ask them about their childhood. Nope. Nope, I didn't, And so, yeah, it's just things like that where for the people who aren't ready for authentic change, who aren't motivated to truly be set free, they have embraced their diagnosis and kind of want to stay there. I'm not for them. And that will come back, that feedback comes back to me through colleagues or just, from other people. So that's okay. I think Jesus did
Yeah.
the same thing, right?
Yeah, he got a lot of pushback, quite a bit, you could say.
Yeah.
Is that tough dealing with people who fundamentally don't want to change, don't want to get better?
Oh, it breaks my heart. Honestly, it's the burden that keeps me going in this field because it's not always a rewarding, job, but it's because I know there are so many people who are still lost and deceived. And that's how I see them. That's how I can continue to have compassion is they just don't know. They still have a veil. They've been taught by way too many people in this world, particularly people with authority, like counselors and doctors, who say, this is the way it is. You're never going to get better. It's generational, it's genetic, it's the way of the world. So you'll just have to stay on this medication, eke through in life, cope the best you can. But healing and freedom, that's just not for you. I think some people have to settle for that because it's too hard on their hearts to be constantly disappointed. Like, I've prayed for that and God didn't heal me, or I've been to counseling for 10 years and it's not helping. I've tried that medication and I don't see any difference. So I just have to settle into this and accept it because the trying and the lack of healing, that's just too hard.
I'm wondering if you could tell me, if you want to comment on this, what you see as far as the social justice influence on the mental health fields.
Say more.
Like kind of the idea of social justice where like identity politics is like a big part of therapy. It's important to instill the client like with a sense of victimhood, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, Ryan, that's just the difference between the world and the kingdom, right? And so the influences of the world, again, will always come back to self and trying to make sense of why human beings act the way they do, which if we leave it up to ourselves and our flesh, it's always going to look wonky. No wonder we end up looking like victims or not knowing, our identity and who we are. We need an absolute truth. We need an anchor and a pillar that brings us back to health. And so that's, I will always come back to that with my clients. I've definitely served every gender, every, sexual orientation, socioeconomic level. Like I've been doing this for 25 years, So I've seen it all. I've spoken to a lot of different people. my message doesn't change.
Mm,
You need absolute truth or you will always flounder. Yeah.
mm.
And yeah, absolutely, that's going to be the world that we're in that battle between the world and the kingdom.
What difference or differences do you notice between men and women who seek help for mental health issues?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would say for men, I tend to put on more of a coaching hat because of their desire to be goal oriented, you know? And so I can still get to a place of pulling them in emotionally, vulnerable, helping them to understand being vulnerable, but it's going to be much more from a coaching perspective, asking those questions that they just don't have the words for a lot of times. I do see that changing. You know, I've been in the field for over 2 decades now, so I see that there is some benefit to the mental health influence in social media. People are starting to understand how to talk about their feelings. So I see that shifting a little bit for men. Whereas for women, I have to stay in that place of compassion. It's much more the emotional, relational component that helps, bring them into it's still about truth for both of them, but I just approach it a little bit different based on how I know they receive information and how they process healing and progress. Yeah, that made sense.
So, how do you see gender relations going? Because we have a declining birth rate, declining rates of marriage. A lot of younger people have never even been on a date. How are you seeing gender relations?
It's scary, isn't it? Yeah. I think it's something that we will see the pendulum will swing. I'm really believing that. You can watch this through the mental health. I've watched it long enough to see the pendulum swing from one extreme to another. And I definitely feel that because although overall you could say that is true, like overall people aren't getting married, overall people aren't going to church like they used to. I've seen all the Barna studies, things like that. But for those that I work with and some of the companies that I run with, there is a hunger in Generation Z, especially. And then this upcoming Generation Alpha, they're sick of it. They're sick of the propaganda, the influence of the world, and they really do want to get back to a place of getting married, having healthy families, being rooted and grounded in community, which is where I believe the greatest healing happens. Um,
Hmm. That is good. That is really interesting. I'm wondering if you could comment specifically on men, because in the last couple decades, we've seen men drop out of education, drop out of the labor force, increased mental illness, increased addiction, suicides on the rise. Like it seems like men are struggling disproportionately right now. What do you see with men going on?
yeah, I think they've just really lost their way. There's a part of what the world is suggesting. Again, it comes back to this be whatever you want to be. And I'm not one who teaches and preaches a lot about like biblical roles because I think even that's been distorted over the years of, what did God design and call men to do or design and call women to do? I just want to go back to what Jesus taught. Who did he say that as followers of him we were called to be? And help men understand and ascribe to that. And that brings mental health. That brings confidence. And they're just not being taught those themes like serving, knowing, how to be strong in your mind and be resilient, learning to sacrifice for your significant other, for other people, all of the things that the world has told them you don't have to do those things. And now they feel empty and worthless and don't know their identity.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Do you sense some kind of a darkness with like contemporary issues that take people away from maybe faith or maybe focus on God? I'm thinking like social media and smartphones, pornography, like video games, these type of things. Do you see like this kind of unique darkness hitting us?
Very much so. Again, just the years of being in practice and seeing those things escalate and the mental health decline. I would also tell you in the area of creativity, and diagnoses like ADHD and ADD, the increase of that, increased diagnoses in narcissism. all of those things I would tell you are direct result of increase in social media, technology, binge watching Netflix, those types of things. We do not give enough negative credit, evil credit to even that. That platform streaming really changed how people watch TV and what that does to the brain, to the emotion, the addiction cycle of never feeling enough. That dopamine that you're looking for, that next hit of the next episode. I mean, we used to have to wait a week or two for the next episode. And then there'd be a holiday and it would be a month before you get to see, what happened. That was healthy. We didn't know that at the time, but there's something about, and we see this often in scripture, about denying self. And what do you do in that time in the process between things? Yeah, some of the scariest statistics I see is people's attention span, 3 or 4 seconds now. Can you imagine 20 years ago if we would have said that in the mental health world or the educational world? Yeah.
We've lost our capacity to be bored.
Yes. Which then leads to a lack of creativity because it's in boredom that our creative side comes out.
How do you see that connection, like this short attention span, inability to tolerate boredom, lack of creativity? How do you see that playing out like on a big societal level?
Total mental illness. And that's what we're seeing. It leads to anxiety. It leads to depression. I'm never happy. The scrolling doesn't make me feel satisfied anymore. There's nothing. If your attention span is 2 or 3 seconds, then even TikTok isn't satisfying anymore. So, yeah. So we really have to get back to one of my other prescriptions is taking those long breaks, like not just half an hour, a day, 3 days that you do a social media or TV detox to really reset your brain and allow some of those chemicals to come back into alignment, and then do things that are more creative, that I'm sure the world today would say are old fashioned, but paint a picture, sew some clothes, like get back to the tactical things and the things that inspire you rather than just being fed, sitting there and being fed.
Yeah, it's so wild how we worked so hard to overcome like having to work in agriculture and make this modern society, and now like a cool hip thing to do is like have a garden,
Isn't that funny?
It's
Yeah.
wild.
Yeah. We come back to what is true, what God designed us to do. Absolutely. We would be much healthier to go back and get rid of some of those modern conveniences. Yeah.
So I mentioned men's mental health a second ago. I feel like I should also ask you about women's mental health because a lot of women are facing more anxiety and depression than they ever have, especially younger women. What do you see going on with them?
It's the same answer. Isn't that funny? And that's why I don't get too focused on, the difference between men and women. We've just lost our way from that which brings us happiness, that which is true joy. And it's just not in the achieving, the being accepted, getting approval, all of the things that I think social media has really encouraged as well. Like how many likes you get, how much influence you have, who takes notice of you. Those types of expectations that we've created in people will always lead to disappointment, to self-rejection. And that's the basis for anxiety. I never have enough. I'm not enough. And it just rolls around inside of us without that tethering of this is what absolute truth looks like. And you are already loved and accepted and have an identity and have a purpose. Purpose is another one of those for men and women. If they don't know that that's ordained, that's a eternal inheritance, that can be the root for depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation. Yeah. So whether it's male or female, my job is to bring them back out of feeling like an orphan, feeling alone, feeling, unattached, and into that truth, that attachment, that love, their place in the kingdom.
One of my mantras that I like to go to is from the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," because so much of my discontent is I want something out here. Something out here is going to make me okay or complete me. and not wanting, like being okay as I am is like a key to a lot of my mental health, I feel like.
Yes, amen. It's one of my favorite Psalms verses. And right after that, I always chuckle about this, is it says, He makes me to lay down.
Mm,
And as a shepherd, because that's what that scripture is about, what they would do is if a sheep was misbehaving, they would take the shepherd's hook, and hook the sheep and make it lay down. So I
mm.
just think when we're anxious and not behaving like we should, that's truly what the Lord is doing, is he's wrangling us back in and saying, hey, listen, rest, it's going to be okay. Yeah.
If you had a magic wand or you're a queen for a day, how would you fix therapy and mental health in America?
Gosh. Wow. Well, you're probably going to laugh, but I would throw it all out. I just don't think there's any hope or that it's even helpful to try to reform it. I think it needs to be completely redone. So a few years ago, the Lord gave me this phrase, it's time for a revolution. And the true definition of that is to throw out an old way of thinking, believing, and behaving, and to bring in a new set of beliefs that impact people's individual lives, government, and the world at large. You can tell I've researched this word. And that's what I think needs to happen with mental health. Like, we have strayed so far from what's helpful. And I've seen people through the last couple decades try to bring it back to something that would be healthier or helpful. And there's certainly things that are. We've made advances in understanding brain science and people have breakthroughs. But as long as we just try to tweak it, we're never going to get to that place where people find that true healing and freedom. So it comes back to James 1, have to be 2 feet in. You cannot be double-minded and say, we're going to take a little of this and a little of Jesus, and then we can make that. It's got to be a total revolt against what's been taught. It's not working. It's not from the Lord. And then base it in biblical principles that actually heal the mind.
I like that. I have one final question for you, and that is, when you look at society more broadly, what is one issue that we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
I think the idea of suffering is the thing that I come back to the most because we can't avoid it. And in some ways, we've become complacent to it. I think of how expensive everything has become over the last couple years, and people are really struggling mentally and financially. And we just kind of shrug our shoulders and keep on going. People are in more debt. They're stressed out with their jobs. I see it and hear it in marriage counseling, and they don't know how to suffer well. That sounds ridiculous, but we just come back to this place of self-soothing and then ignoring problems until they manifest physically. It's the biggest reason people have physical issues is because they're not dealing with the things that actually stress them out. They're just numbing it. So my job is to teach people, how do we suffer well? That sounds ridiculous, but it's to deal with the hardships that we have that are in front of us and to really thrive, even in the midst of difficult circumstances.
I like that answer. Dr. Stone, where can people find you?
My website is kingdommindset.global. I also have an app, Kingdom Mindset Global, lots of free resources and stuff on there. And then social media, I'm mostly under Jessica Stone.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I enjoyed our conversation.
Me too. Very like-minded. It was a blast.
Yes, absolutely.